begin our discussion of the Great Depression, let's go back to the election in 1928. The election which brought Herbert Hoover to power. Calvin Coolidge, who had been president, elected in 1924, and who had taken over after the death of Warren G. Harding, decided not to run for a second term, perhaps because of health reasons, perhaps because he wanted to respect the two-term limit. But as a result, Herbert Hoover was a sure bet for the Republican nomination in 1928. And when Herbert Hoover ran for office, he already had a long and storied career. Hoover had served as the Secretary of Commerce under both Warren G. Harding as well as Calvin Coolidge. He had been a progressive Republican, and during World War I, he had organized food relief in Europe, earning high marks from Americans for how competently and efficiently he ran food relief, particularly for the Belgian people who were devastated by that war. And he found tremendous success as the food administrator. Now, Herbert Hoover was a self-made man. He was an orphan, and then he had made a fortune for himself in mining. And as an example of a self-made man who had depended upon nobody but himself for his own successes, he believed that people should work hard and get ahead. But he was also inspired by the progressive influence, the progressive tradition in America, and that he did believe that unfettered competition could result in ruin for America and its businesses. He believed that business and government should cooperate together. And he hoped to curb ruinous competition between various businesses and to improve the standard of living. He believed that the concert of interests, businesses and government working together in association, could achieve great progressive results, which would result in uplifting the condition of factory workers and everybody else. He did not believe in a role for government regulation. He was a Republican after all, but he did believe that private agencies could direct regulatory and welfare policies and bring on an era of cooperation which would benefit both business and the American people. Now, Herbert Hoover's ideas were outlined in a book called American Individualism. And again, Herbert Hoover was a self-made millionaire who had made his career in the mining industry. He didn't even take a presidential salary. Just like John F. Kennedy later, he would designate his salary to charity. But nevertheless, he did believe in a diminished role for the state. He condemned government regulation since he believed that government regulation interfered with economic opportunities and slowed economic growth. But the self-interested motives promoted by capitalism should and could be put to public use and to the public good. And in trying to bring together closer cooperation between businesses and the government, not through regulation, but through voluntary cooperation, Herbert Hoover promised to banish poverty during his term. Ironic, considering what would actually happen during his term. When Herbert Hoover ran for president in 1928, he ran against Al Smith, who was a rising star in New York progressivism following his role in investigating the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and other similar industrial disasters, and Smith was an important political figure in New York City. He represented the continuing progressive tradition, and he was instrumental in getting laws passed which limited working hours for women and children in New York City. But Al Smith was also on the wrong side of the cultural wars of the 1920s. He served 3 terms as governor from New York, but he had come up through the notoriously corrupt Tammany Hall, even as it changed from an institution that oversaw the organization of Irish voters into a political machine that represented reform politics, and again, especially in the wake of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Now, Al Smith was of immigrant stock himself, and he represented the new immigrants through Tammany. Now, Al Smith himself was descended from Irish ancestors, but he still took on the interests of the so-called new immigrants, the Eastern and Southern Europeans who were immigrating en masse to the United States, at least until the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. And in and imagining himself as the champion of these new immigrants, Al Smith denounced the Red Scare. He defended Sacco and Vanzetti, and he opposed prohibition, which he believed, even though it was popular in the countryside in the United States, was particularly targeted at immigrants living in the city, because people out in the countryside associated bootlegging and the many violent excesses of the Prohibition period with urban vice, and particularly the immigrants who Al Smith sought to represent. And in fact, when Al Smith had run for president in 1924, nativists and Klansmen alike had blocked his nomination for the Democratic Party. But he did win nomination in 1928. But his Catholicism became the focus of the race. And remember, there would not be a Catholic president until the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960. And Smith's Catholicism was a real thorn in the side of his campaign. In this particular context, there had even recently been a law passed in Oregon which outlawed private schools. And the reason that private schools were outlawed is because people in Oregon did not want the Catholic Church participating in the education of children. Al Smith was so unpopular with old-line white conservatives that, in fact, for the first time ever, Republicans actually carried part of the South because there was so much rejection amongst white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to Al Smith's candidacy. Ultimately, Al Smith's candidacy was doomed to failure, and Hoover won 58% of the vote. Nevertheless, it's important to recognize that Smith laid the foundation for what would later be Franklin Delano Roosevelt's coalition of urban ethnic people, the working class, and Southern whites. So Herbert Hoover gets elected, which brings us to our next major event in the chronology of the coming of the Great Depression. That is, of course, the stock market crash. Confidence in future earnings tipped in late October 1929, and on Black Tuesday, October 29th, stocks lost $18 billion of their net value, or 18%. $10 billion with a B, dollars disappeared from the stock market in 5 hours. Now, why did the stock market shake so suddenly? Well, many investment firms had been buying stocks on 10% margin, meaning that they were paying 10% to buy the stock and then putting the rest on credit. But when the stocks devalued and those loans were called in, they were unable to make up the 90% that they had bought on credit. Call loans were also common, where lenders could lend people the money to buy stocks and then call in the balance later, and stockbrokers were allowing people to buy stocks on credit, but they called for the balance when the principal dipped below a certain amount. Nevertheless, the stock market had already been showing softness in durable goods and real estate, largely because during the course of the 1920s, most people who wanted to buy these new durable goods, automobiles, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, waffle irons, had already bought one. And hence, there was an oversupply of these goods. This, in addition to banks beginning to call in loans, meant that there was a real dearth in capital and liquidity. Holding companies had also pyramided, putting their weakest companies on the bottom, hiding the fact that, in fact, there were people within these holding companies within, that were losing money, but they hid it from the investors. In 1929, dividends stopped coming on. They could not continue to pay interest to their holders, and some investors had even unloaded their stocks, even as they told their clients to hold on. Banks had knowingly sold worthless bonds, and there was an investigation, and ultimately the president of the New York Stock Exchange ended up in jail, but nevertheless, the stock market continued to collapse. Now, there were other causes for this stock market crash. And in fact, the depression was not caused by the stock market crash. Because the depression lasted entirely too long. the Depression would not have lasted so long had it just been because of a stock market crash. In fact, there were signs of economic trouble already present long before the crash occurred. Speculation in real estate in Florida and Southern California had started to dry up. A construction boom in the 1920s led to a bubble in housing starts. They were building too many houses. Supply outstripped demand. And as soon as the economy went south, the real estate bubble burst. In 1932 alone, 250,000 homes inhabited by Americans were foreclosed on. In addition, there was an unequal distribution of wealth. As we've seen in the 1920s, wealth became increasingly concentrated at the top. There was a depression in farm areas and in unskilled laborers, particularly the mining sectors as well as the textile sectors. And in these sectors, the workers who labored in these areas of the economy had reduced purchasing power. And in fact, there was an unequal distribution of the wealth, which is exacerbated by pro-business, low-tax Republican dominance in the 1920s. In fact, Coolidge had lowered taxes on the wealthy even further. Now, an average wage earner might spend up to half of their income to buy a car, but by the late 1920s, most people who could afford to buy these things already had. Overproduction and an unequal tax code slowed consumption. And in fact, had anybody noticed or cared to look or seen this as a sign of bad things to come, sales of new autos and other consumer goods were already declining after 1926. Of course, the stock market triggered a much wider depression, which was not caused by the stock market. The stock market was a symptom of the Great Depression that was to come, but the economic crash had immediate effects upon Americans. By the fall of 1929, 3 million Americans were out of work. And this was particularly in areas that had already been on decline during the 1920s: coal mines, textile mills, lumber, railroad industries. And in fact, the closing of coal mines and textile mills in Pennsylvania and New England had already created the first post-industrial landscapes in American history. Furthermore, as the Depression set on, people ran to the banks to try and get their money out, and this rush on the banks wiped out millions of families' life savings. Now, the wealthy were hurt too. The Rockefellers lost 80% of their money in the stock market crash, but they could still get by. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of people who did not have employment, and remember, during the Great Depression, employment is going to reach upwards of 25%. That's 5 times what we have right now. 25% of people lost their jobs. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the road looking to improve their circumstances through geographic mobility. Bread lines became a common sight as cities across the nation spent all the money that they had on poor relief. Ramshackle shanty towns made up of clapboard shacks of people looking for some way to shelter themselves from the element during this terrible impoverishment. These shanty towns sprang up all over America. Sometimes they were called Hoovervilles in honor of the president who seemed particularly unsympathetic to the plight of the hundreds of thousands of Americans who were newly out of work, unemployed, and impoverished. Hoovervilles could be found in parks and on abandoned land, and most famously in Central Park itself. Meanwhile, cities like Chicago went broke, paying for poor relief. With the stock market crash having been the first indicator of this Great Depression setting on, suddenly businesses that had been so celebrated during the 1920s as the cause of the great economic boom that occurred in some industries during that decade, suddenly they went from being, the sort of exemplar of American prosperity to the bad guy. Now, there was not mass social unrest in America. There were some protests. There were a lot of bank robberies. In fact, bank robberies spiked during this time period. But since socialists had been run out of the country during the Red Scare, there weren't really that many around to organize massive labor upheavals. And in fact, the Communist Party, which had been Powerful in America in the years prior to the 1920s had been atomized, fragmented by the occurrences in Russia, some people taking one faction over another. In fact, the Communist Party even began recruiting workers for Russia from the United States. Stalin offered to help skilled workers immigrate to the Soviet Union during the Depression to participate in five-year plans. And in fact, quite a few American workers did take the Soviet Union up on that offer. During the time period of the Depression, the Communist Party's membership did increase, but not in line with the efforts. They especially tried to recruit amongst African Americans and industrial workers, but nevertheless, we're not going to see major labor unrest for a few more years. But once FDR is in office, there will be a great labor upheaval. So what we see then is widespread unemployment, breadlines, the stock market has crashed, people are no longer earning returns on their investment. In fact, they've lost their investments. The banks are closing because people are running on the banks to get their money out, and the banks do not have enough held in reserve to pay everybody, and they have to close their doors. Now, what is Hoover's response to this? Belt tightening. He believed that economic downturns were a part of capitalism. He encouraged belt tightening. What I mean by that is that people try and save their money and spend less, relying on traditional 19th century ideas of thrift and frugality, saying that ultimately just allow the market to work its magic, and eventually the market will return to form. Largely, Hoover refused to help individuals. He believed that federal aid weakened the sturdiness of American national character, and he did not believe that direct aid should go directly to the unemployed. The Federal Reserve even curtailed the amount of money in circulation during these years. Now, Hoover raised interest rates. That caused yet another decline in liquidity and credit, and he introduced a very poorly timed tariff, the Hooley-Smoot tariff. By trying to raise prices on imports, Hoover thought that he would be able to spur demand for American products. But the problem is, of course, that Americans do not have the money to buy American or anybody else's products, and by slapping a tariff on foreign goods, foreign countries responded in kind, and they stopped buying American goods, meaning that one important outlet for goods that are not being sold in America because of this depression evaporates as well once overseas markets close themselves off to American goods as well. Foreign countries stopped importing American goods because of this tariff, and that hurt American investment, the American economy, even more. In fact, Hoover even tried to balance the budget, although Franklin Roosevelt thought that would be a good idea as well. But belt tightening, right? This did not address the main problem. Consumer spending had become enormously important to the economy. Consumer spending was the grease that oiled the wheels of capitalism that continued to expand in the 1920s. The problem was that by the end of the 1920s, there was more supply than there was demand. There were not enough people demanding these products, which were being produced by this industrial economy. The stock market indicated this softness, and then the entire economy cratered as a result. Hoover struggled. He was very uncomfortable with government solutions to economic downturns. He did establish the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which sought to make loans available to banks and corporations, but he actually spent less than Congress authorized, and this is very different than the kind of economic ideas which we will emerge from the Great Depression, where we start to see the government as being a sort of a partner to the economy by spending money in order to increase production and particularly demand for consumer goods. But, even though Congress authorized this money through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Hoover refused to lend money to failing institutions, which were exactly the institutions which needed money the most. And while the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was lending money to businesses which at least seemed to be solvent, many Americans wondered why he didn't help the common people. Taking it upon themselves to pressure Herbert Hoover force him to deal with individual Americans who were out of work, the bonus march, these veterans of World War I who were promised a bonus by the government after their service in World War I, marched on Washington to see if they could get their bonus a little bit early in order to deal with the tremendous depression which had set on. And in spring of 1932, about 20,000 unemployed World War I veterans rode the rails with their families to Washington, D.C. This bonus, which was due to them in 1945 as part of their pension, they thought it would be fair enough if the government would give it to them early. They were rebuffed when they arrived, however, and as a result, these bonus marchers set up a shanty town in Washington, D.C., well within the view of the federal capital itself. With so many people camped in Washington, D.C., with a increased police presence, violence inevitably broke out, and an officer was shot down. Hoover authorized Douglas MacArthur to burn the bonus marchers' camp to the ground. Hoover, who had already seemed out of touch with Americans, by taking out the full fury of the military against this group of marchers who had established themselves in Washington, D.C., made Hoover look like a very unsympathetic character. And as a result, his popularity, which had already been waning since the beginning of the Depression, absolutely cratered, setting the stage for the arrival of a new political factor in the form of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.